Have you ever thought that the richest person in the world could also be the poorest? Today, I will tell you the story of David Obama, a billionaire so successful that everything he touched turned to gold. But his life was just a series of soulless numbers and ultimate loneliness. Until one fateful night, all the glamour expensive suits and million-dollar contracts came crashing down when he found a 6-year-old girl curled up in a pile of garbage. One moment, one question, and a life changed forever. This story will show you that money can't buy happiness, but kindness has the power to save an entire world. Welcome to Big Value of the Word, and let's listen to The Dance of Solitude and The Dream of Dawn. The soft jazz music flowed languidly across the golden walls of the ballroom. The light from crystal chandeliers sparkled, reflecting off dozens of faces that wore smiles, yet all of them were empty. David Obama, 32 years old, stood in the midst of that dazzling ball like a living statue. Tall and elegant in his bespoke Savile Row suit, his gray-blue eyes, however, bore a weariness that had settled deep into his bones. He heard an older woman praising him for the billion-dollar deal he had just completed. "It's unbelievable, David. You've done something no one dared to even think of," she said. David offered a polite smile enough to satisfy her, but in his mind it was just a number, a soulless sequence of digits on an electronic screen. His life, David thought, had turned into a string of meaningless transactions. Everything had a price, every emotion could be quantified, and every relationship was based on self-interest. He avoided enthusiastic handshakes, the hollow offers of people trying to win his favor. The tie suddenly felt suffocating, like a shackle that restrained his freedom. David quietly loosened it, massaging his temple, feeling a dull headache creeping in. He looked around at the people, those whom he had once admired, and saw them as nothing more than puppets dancing in a play he had grown tired of. They spoke of the stock market, of million-dollar deals, but their voices were cold and indifferent like machines. His gaze wandered, passing through the large windows overlooking the city. The towering skyscrapers, illuminated by bright lights, resembled giant fingers reaching up to touch the night sky. He had built one of those towers, a financial empire that many dreamt of, but he couldn't find a small corner that he could call his own. The loneliness suddenly felt more intense than ever. It wasn't the feeling of missing others, but the emptiness that lingered even when he was surrounded by people. He remembered his childhood days when he wandered through dark alleys with only a buttered bread as his companion. Back then, he was hungry, but his heart was full of hope. Now he had everything, yet nothing at all. Unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere of the party, David decided to leave. He politely nodded, stepping out of the grand hall where the neon lights blazed like cuts into his tired eyes. He didn't call a cab. Instead, he walked alone along the sidewalk, letting the cold night wind blow away the chaotic thoughts in his mind. He followed the familiar streets from his boyhood. He passed shuttered stores, empty cafes, and finally stopped at a dark alley. Here there were no bright lights, no laughter, only the silence of the night and the damp smell of trash bags. He stepped deeper into the alley, a desperate escape from the world he had created. But it was in this dark and filthy place that a fateful moment awaited him. David stopped standing silently in the dark alley. The strong stench of garbage and the damp air enveloped him, a jarring contrast to the luxurious perfume and the cold air conditioning of the party. He tried to breathe deeply, feeling his lungs being freed from the suffocation. Then he heard a sound, a faint rustling like a mouse running through the trash. He was not one to startle easily, but the silence of the alley made the sound seem strange. The light from his phone screen became the only source of illumination, casting a glow on the black trash bags piled like a small mountain. David squinted, and he saw a dirty, ragged cloth. At first he thought it was just an old blanket discarded carelessly, but then he saw something small and frail poking out from underneath. A finger, a tiny, filthy finger trembling slightly. David's heart tightened. He moved closer, the initial curiosity turning into an indescribable unease. Gently, he used the toe of his shoe to nudge the trash bag aside, and the light from his phone illuminated a small, frail figure. It was not an animal. A head of black hair hung over most of the face. David's eyes widened, horrified. He knelt down, brushing the strands of hair aside, and everything inside him seemed to collapse. Beneath the layer of dirt and bruises was the face of a little girl, no older than 6. The girl curled up, huddled in a torn, puffy coat, her shoes with their soles torn off, barely holding together. In her arms was a teddy bear. The teddy bear was no longer whole. One ear had been singed and one plastic eye had disappeared, leaving only a black hole. It was no longer a toy, but a heartbreaking testament to a tragic story. David stared at the teddy bear and he felt an electric shock run down his spine. It was not just a discarded toy, it was a destroyed childhood. A deep, unexplainable sorrow flooded over him. All thoughts of money status and million-dollar deals vanished. He had spent his life building a world of numbers and control, but now he was utterly helpless in the face of the image of a tiny, fragile being. He had once thought of himself as a winner in every battle, but right now he realized he was standing on an entirely different battlefield where wealth held no meaning. David stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the little girl. His hands trembled, not daring to touch her, afraid that she might vanish. He had been through many pivotal moments in his life, but this was the first time he felt completely lost. A homeless little girl, a burned teddy bear, and a real-world reality he had always tried to avoid. Suddenly, he realized that behind the glamorous facade of parties and luxury cars, there existed a world full of pain and harshness. And tonight, the door to that world had opened right before his eyes. David trembled as he reached out his hand, but then froze. He didn't know what to do. His entire life had been built on control and numbers, but in front of the image of a tiny, helpless girl, all his knowledge and experience seemed meaningless. He lowered his voice, his words choking in his throat. "Hey, little one." The girl slowly opened her eyes. Those eyes held no fear nor any hope. They were empty, like two black holes that had swallowed every emotion. That gaze made David feel colder than the night air itself. It was a terrifying acceptance of fate, a resignation that should never exist on the face of a child. David spoke gently. "Are you all alone?" The girl didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, at his expensive suit, at his shiny leather shoes, and then her gaze fixed on the teddy bear in her hands. She clutched it tighter, an unconscious act of self-defense. "Uncle, I won't hurt you," David said, his voice becoming more urgent. He knelt down, kneeling on the filthy ground. For the first time in his life, David Obama knelt before something other than money or power. "Where are your parents?" His question, light as a sigh, struck his heart like a powerful blow. The girl's face remained expressionless, but her words were not. "They're dead." Her voice was tiny, hoarse, yet crystal clear. "In the fire." It was a simple sentence, but it struck David like a knife to the heart. Everything within him shattered. David Obama, who had once led million-dollar negotiations, who had withstood every pressure, now found himself completely broken. He couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears flowed down his face, hot and relentless, streaming down his cheeks, mingling with the dust in the alley. He cried not out of pity for the girl, but out of helplessness. He cried for a pain he could not heal. He cried for the emptiness within himself and for a world where money could not buy a childhood. "Uncle!" The girl said, her voice hesitant. For the first time, a hint of emotion appeared in her eyes, the confusion at seeing a wealthy man sobbing uncontrollably. David couldn't say anything. He lowered his head, letting the tears fall onto the cold ground. The image of a powerful man and a homeless girl was so painfully contrasting, like a reminder that money was just a mask, and beneath it there were raw pains. He had always tried to avoid facing this truth, but now he had no choice but to confront it. After a long silence, David looked up, his eyes red. He gathered all his courage and spoke slowly. "Would you like to come home with me? I have food, a warm bed." The girl looked at him. Her blank gaze returned, and then she asked a single question, one that would change David's life forever. Why? That simple question hit David straight in the mind. Why, he couldn't answer. He wasn't doing this out of social responsibility, nor to make up for past wrongs. He was doing this because of an urge he couldn't explain, an emotion he had never experienced. The girl's question forced him to look at himself, to examine the life he had lived, a life built on emptiness and loneliness. He realized that in his effort to save a child, he might also be seeking redemption for himself. David held Mary's small hand. Her hand was cold and thin bony. The Rolls-Royce glided through the night, but the air inside felt heavy. Mary remained silent, her eyes fixed on the twinkling city lights through the window. David glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Her face was smeared with dirt, her hair messy, and there was a loneliness in her that mirrored his own. He felt a strange urge to say something, but didn't know where to begin. When the car stopped in front of the towering skyscraper, Mary looked up. David was used to seeing people amazed by this luxury, but not Mary. She wasn't amazed. She only seemed empty, with a vague fear in her eyes. David's penthouse, an architectural masterpiece with soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and minimalist cold furniture, now appeared under her gaze, no different than a luxurious morgue. Mary walked across the gleaming marble floor, each step echoing softly. She stopped in front of an abstract sculpture, hesitantly reaching out to touch it. The sculpture, worth millions of dollars, had never meant anything to David. But as he watched Mary, he saw it for what it truly was, soulless. His home, David realized, wasn't a sanctuary, it was a museum, a place to display wealth and success, but with no trace of life. "Are you hungry?" David asked, his voice uneasy. He had never had to cook a meal for himself. His dinners were always luxurious outings at renowned restaurants, but now he found himself standing in the modern kitchen, feeling clumsy. He pulled out a pack of pasta and fumbled around looking for a pot. Everything was automatic, yet he felt as awkward as a child. Mary sat on a tall bar stool, her feet not quite touching the ground. She looked at David. He was no longer the powerful man in a sharp suit. Now he was just a man awkwardly trying to make something as simple as dinner. David poured water into the pot, turned on the stove, but then forgot what to do next. He frantically Googled how to cook pasta. Mary chuckled softly, her laughter like the ringing of a tiny bell. For the first time, a lively sound filled the house. David turned around and saw Mary's smile. He felt warmth spread through him. Once the pasta was boiled, he mixed it with some ketchup. The meal wasn't good, in fact it was a bit mushy, but it was the most genuine meal he had ever had. Mary ate eagerly each bite, each spoonful, as if it had been a long time since she had a proper meal. While Mary ate, David picked up his phone. He called his assistant Sarah. "Cancel all appointments for tomorrow," David ordered. "Sir, even the meeting with the Japanese investors?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with surprise. "All of them," David insisted. "And I need you to do something for me. Buy clothes, shoes, everything a little girl needs. Send them to my apartment right away." "A little girl, sir. Is she your daughter?" David paused for a moment. He looked at Mary, who was eating happily. "Not yet," he said, but a warm, unfamiliar feeling spread through him. He ended the call and looked back at Mary. The house was still cold, but now it had a heart. David lay on the leather sofa in the living room, trying to sleep. The house was eerily quiet, but that silence only made him feel more restless than ever. He could hear Mary's steady breathing from the guest room. She had fallen asleep after the simple meal. He closed his eyes, but his mind stayed awake, replaying the images of the day. From a successful billionaire, he had become a man fumbling in the kitchen. From cold negotiations, he had faced a heartbreaking story. He had never felt so helpless, and yet, strangely, he had never felt more alive. As the night wore on, David drifted into a restless sleep. But his sleep didn't last long. A sharp, desperate scream echoed from Mary's room, tearing through the stillness of the night. "Daddy, save me from the fire!" The scream repeated, each cry filled with sheer terror. David shot up, his heart pounding. He rushed to Mary's room. The door flew open and he saw her curled up on the bed, trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her face was pale, her wide eyes staring at an empty space as if she was reliving that horrifying moment. "Daddy, I'm scared!" Mary screamed, her voice choking in her throat. This was the first time David truly felt the extreme fear of another person. He no longer thought about work or reputation. There was only one overwhelming urge to soothe this pain. He ran to her, knelt by the bed, and pulled her tightly into his arms. "It's okay now, Mary. I'm here. I will protect you." Mary's frail, tiny body trembled in his arms. David could feel each of her ribs through her thin clothes, a heartbreaking testament to the time she had spent on the streets. He held her close, feeling her shivers gradually subside. Mary buried her head in his shoulder, sobbing. The warmth from David seemed to ease the nightmares that haunted her. "Don't be scared. I won't let anything hurt you anymore," David whispered. He gently stroked her tangled hair. "It's all over. I'll stay here right beside you." Mary looked up at him, her eyes still filled with tears. She grasped at the sleeve of his shirt, a simple action, but one that held a miraculous power. David understood that she needed reassurance, a promise that no amount of money could ever buy. He picked Mary up and carried her toward his own bedroom. The The large room, the king-size bed, was a stark contrast to where she had slept before. "We both need to sleep in a safer place tonight," David said, his voice warm. "If the nightmares come back, I'll be here to chase them away." Mary didn't say anything, simply holding him tighter. David placed her gently on the bed, tucking her in carefully. He lay down beside her, leaving the nightlight dimly glowing. Mary reached out her small hand, searching for his. David took her hand, gripping it tightly. His hand was large, warm, enclosing her tiny cold one. In that moment, David realized something he had never thought of before. He had spent his entire life chasing success, power, and material things, but none of that could compare to the feeling of peace when he held this small hand. His life, David knew, had found its meaning, not in numbers, but in the existence of a little girl who had taught him how to love, how to be human. He gently squeezed Mary's hand, and together they drifted into sleep, David's first peaceful sleep. The next morning, when Mary woke up, she found herself lying on a large, soft bed. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, flooding the room with warmth. The strange feeling of warmth made her want to cry. Sitting on the sofa, David had swapped his expensive suit for a simple t-shirt. He was reading a children's book, Winnie the Pooh, which his assistant had hastily bought the night before. Mary walked over, rubbing her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" David asked, his voice gentle. Mary nodded. "Uncle David," she said, "can I go to school?" Her question caught David off guard. He had forgotten that a normal child would go to school, learn, and play. "Of course," David replied. "But first, we need a few things." They went to the shopping mall. It was a completely different world. The lights, the sounds, and the glamour of luxury brands left Mary stunned. She walked through the glittering aisles like an alien. Her gaze didn't show desire, only wonder and a bit of fear. She tightened her grip on David's hand, as if afraid to get lost in this strange world. David took her to a children's clothing store. "Pick whatever you like," he said. But Mary didn't rush to pick anything. She just stood there looking at the new clothes with cautious eyes. "I only need one set," she said softly. David felt a lump in his throat. He was used to shopping without looking at the price, but for Mary, even a single new outfit was a luxury. In the end, Mary chose a simple light pink dress. David bought several other items, but she still clutched that one dress tightly in her arms. As they passed a shoe store, Mary stopped. She stared at a pair of pink sneakers with flashing lights in the soles. Her eyes suddenly lit up, sparkling with a simple joy that David had long forgotten. He knelt down, helping her try them on. The shoes were too big, but when Mary walked, the tiny lights on, the soles blinked. She laughed, a clear, ringing laugh that filled the entire store. It was a joy that David, with all his wealth, could never buy. When they returned to the car, David noticed Mary pointing out onto the street. She began telling him about the people who had helped her. "That lady," Mary pointed at an old woman sitting on a bench. "She shared some bread with me. That man," she pointed to an older man rummaging through a trash can, "he gave me a can of tuna." David drove silently. He had been down these streets thousands of times, but he had never truly seen the city. He only saw the numbers, real estate values, revenue profits. But through Mary's eyes, he saw stories, people, and acts of kindness hidden behind the rough exterior of the streets. David stopped the car. He got out and walked over to the elderly woman and the homeless man. He didn't just give them money. He talked to them, listened to their stories. He bought them a hot meal and a warm coat. David realized that wealth was not about what he owned, but how he used it to help others. This was the first day in his life that David felt he was not just a number, but a human being. After that day, David realized that the city he lived in wasn't just made of towering skyscrapers and huge numbers. It was also made up of lives of stories. He returned home, and the idea for a new project began to sprout in his mind. This wasn't an investment deal, but a project born from the heart. He called Sarah, his assistant, and told her about buying an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. "We won't build a skyscraper," David said. "We will build a center, a shelter for the homeless." Sarah didn't ask any questions. She just listened to his voice, a voice filled with emotion that she had never heard before. The project was named the Aurora Fund, inspired by the Latin word for dawn. David wanted it to be a new beginning, a dawn for the lives that had been forgotten. Mary, with the innocence of a child, became a special advisor for the project. "Uncle David," she asked, "can we make a space for dogs? Homeless people love their dogs, but they have nowhere to live." Her idea surprised David. He had thought about bedrooms, dining rooms, and clinics, but he had never thought about a space for pets. He smiled and nodded. "That's a great idea, Mary." Mary also contributed to the decoration. She suggested painting the walls with bright colors and hanging her own drawings on them. David had hired top architects, but Mary's ideas moved him more than anything else. One afternoon, David came home to find Mary sitting on the floor, busily drawing. Her drawing wasn't a complex work of art, but a simple house with a red roof and a chimney with smoke rising. What was special about it was that the front door of the house was drawn wide open, and beneath it were the words written in crooked handwriting, "Welcome." David stood still looking at the picture. He had designs that were complex with sharp lines and expensive materials, but nothing compared to this. Mary's picture captured the essence of the project, a place without judgment, a place that welcomed everyone. It was a reminder that kindness doesn't come from money, but from the generosity of the heart. David took Mary's drawing, carefully framed it, and hung it in his office. It became the symbol of the Aurora Fund. Whenever he felt tired or discouraged, all he had to do was look at the picture and find motivation. This project wasn't about fame or profit, but something deeper. It came from a seed of compassion that had been sown into his once dry heart by a small girl, and now that seed was slowly blossoming. One autumn morning, David and Mary went to the courthouse. This was the most important day of David's life, the hearing to gain permanent guardianship of Mary. The courtroom was cold and full of gravitas. David sat opposite a panel of experts, a judge, a social worker, and a child psychologist. They weren't interested in his financial empire, only in whether he was fit to be the father of a child. David had prepared thoroughly, dozens of pages with his financial records evidence that he had hired the best people to care for Mary. His speech was carefully crafted, every sentence logical and persuasive. But when he looked at Mary sitting beside him, holding his hand tightly, he knew that all the numbers and words were meaningless. The social worker, a woman with a stern expression, began to ask questions. "Mr. Obama, your records show that you are a single man with a busy schedule. Your work requires you to travel frequently. How can you guarantee a stable environment for this girl?" David answered calmly, "I've adjusted my schedule. I've canceled all unnecessary business trips. My focus now is not work, but Mary." The psychologist continued, "You have never had experience as a father. We are concerned about your ability to build a healthy, emotional relationship with a child who has endured significant psychological trauma." David felt anxious. Their questions were sharp like knives, and he felt as though he was being judged. They looked at him as if he were a billionaire eccentric who suddenly wanted to buy a child to satisfy a passing whim. Then it was the judge's turn. He looked directly at David. "Mr. Obama, I've reviewed your file. Everything looks perfect on paper, but I want to ask one question. Why? Why are you doing all of this?" That question cut straight into David's heart. It was exactly the same question Mary had asked him in the dark alley. David knew that this was his one chance. He pushed aside the papers he had prepared and placed them on the table. He took a deep breath and looked at Mary sitting beside him. "I don't have a perfect answer on paper," David said, his voice trembling but full of sincerity. "At first, I didn't know why. I had lived a life full of numbers transactions. I thought that was everything. But then I found Mary. She didn't ask me about money, about status. She asked me why. That question forced me to look at myself." David paused and took out a drawing from his briefcase. It was the picture Mary had drawn of the house with the word "Welcome." He placed the drawing on the table. "This is my answer," David said. "She taught me to see the world not through numbers, but through stories. She taught me that happiness isn't about what I have, but about what I can do for others. She taught me how to love." David's voice caught. "I never intended to be a father," he said, his eyes red. "But she chose me. She gave me a purpose. She turned my cold house into a home. She saved my life. I don't know if I'm worthy to be her father, but I can promise you I will spend the rest of my life learning how to love her. And I will never, never abandon her." The courtroom fell silent. David's words weren't a speech, but a declaration from the heart. Mary gripped his hand tightly. She might not fully understand everything he said, but she could feel the genuine love and pain in his voice. David's battle was no longer a battle on paper. It was a battle for his heart to be recognized. A week after the hearing, David and Mary lived in a tense state of anticipation. Every ring of the phone made David's heart race. He no longer thought about deals or investments. All his focus was on one thing, Mary's fate. On Monday morning, as David was preparing breakfast for Mary, the phone rang. He saw the lawyer's name on the screen. David took a deep breath and signaled for Mary to come closer. She ran over and gripped his hand tightly. David put the phone on speaker. "Hello, David." The lawyer's voice came through. "I have the judge's decision." The air grew eerily quiet. Both David and Mary held their breath. Fear and hope intertwined in David's heart. He could feel Mary's small hand trembling. She didn't understand the legal jargon, but she could sense his anxiety. "The decision is permanent guardianship," the lawyer said, his voice tinged with emotion. "Congratulations, David. You've done a miracle." David dropped to his knees. He hugged Mary tightly, tears streaming down his face. Mary didn't understand what permanent guardianship meant, but she could feel David's overwhelming joy. She looked at him and smiled softly. Her smile and her bright, clear laughter filled the room, a sound of happiness that had long been absent from the penthouse. "What does that mean, Uncle David?" Mary asked, her voice pure and clear. David looked straight into her eyes, eyes that were no longer empty but filled with trust. He gently stroked her cheek, his voice trembling with emotion. "It means you'll stay with me, forever if you want." Mary smiled a radiant smile like the sun. "I want to," she said. To celebrate this important day, David took Mary shopping. It wasn't for toys or expensive clothes, but for her very first school uniform. Mary stood in front of the mirror, wearing a crisp white shirt, a plaid skirt, and carrying a small backpack. She looked at her reflection, then turned to David a little shy. "Will I look like the other kids, Uncle David?" David smiled a genuine smile from the bottom of his heart. He knelt down, adjusting the collar of her shirt. "You're not like them," he said, his voice full of love. "You're better than anyone I've ever known." Those words weren't just a comfort. They were a declaration of her worth, of the path they had walked together. Mary was no longer a homeless, abandoned child. She was David's daughter, the light that had shone into his life. David Obama's life had completely changed after the court's decision. His alarm clock was no longer a reminder for an early meeting, but a signal to prepare breakfast for Mary. David, who once lived in a rush, now took time to learn how to make simple dishes like buttered toast or scrambled eggs. He was clumsy, but each time he saw Mary eating happily, he felt a strange happiness. David had rearranged his work schedule. Instead of attending late meetings, he prioritized taking Mary to school. He sat in the car, patiently waiting, watching his daughter interact with her friends. He realized that those moments were worth more than any multi-million-dollar contract. In the afternoons, he returned home earlier, not to work, but to help Mary with her homework. He relearned simple math problems, children's poems, and realized that despite being small, this knowledge brought him a peace that complex financial expertise could never provide. David's evenings were no longer filled with extravagant parties. Instead, he had cozy dinners with Mary at home. He learned how to cook simple meals, and though sometimes the food burned, Mary still ate happily, making him feel like the best chef in the world. He read books with her, watched cartoons, and the happiest moments for him were when Mary trusted him enough to tell him stories from school about her new friends and what she had learned. David listened without judgment and realized that he was living more fully, not just working. David's Aurora Fund continued to grow. It had become a true shelter for the homeless, a warm place with hot meals, soft beds, and smiles. David still ran his business, but his focus had shifted. He no longer sought profit, but stories' hopes. He listened to the homeless, helped them find jobs, and helped them reclaim their lives. In an interview, when a reporter asked David about his transformation, he simply smiled and replied, "I once thought I was the richest man in the world. But since I had Mary, I realized how poor I truly was. She taught me that wealth isn't something you accumulate, but something you give away. Happiness isn't about successful deals, but the smile of a child, helping my daughter with homework, and cozy dinners at home." David had learned how to braid Mary's hair, something he had once thought impossible. He woke up early, carefully braiding her hair. Every morning when he saw Mary skipping off to school with her neatly braided hair, David's heart would overflow with happiness. He was no longer lonely, no longer empty. His life had a new purpose, a new heart, and it all began from a fateful moment in a dark alley. One late afternoon, David returned home after a long day at work. His footsteps were no longer hurried, but leisurely, as if he were walking back to a place where he truly belonged. He opened the door, and the smell of food wafted from the kitchen, accompanied by the sound of colored pencils scratching on paper. Mary was sitting on the living room floor, engrossed in her drawing. The entire room, which had once been cold and empty, was now filled with innocent sketches, colorful pillows, and toys. David quietly approached. He didn't say anything, just stood there silently watching his little girl. Mary didn't notice him standing behind her. She was focused on coloring a large picture. The picture wasn't of an animal or a fairy tale house. It was of the two of them. David saw himself in the picture not in a fancy suit, but in a simple t-shirt. He was sitting on a couch, and beside him was Mary. Both of them were smiling. Above them was a radiant sun, and around them were flowers in all colors. Neatly written with a few smudges were the words, "Our home." David's throat tightened. Mary's drawing was the final confirmation of their journey. It was no longer a solitary house, no longer a museum of wealth, but a family, a home. David bent down and hugged Mary tightly. She looked up at him and smiled brightly. Later, David took the drawing. He carefully framed it, just as he had done with the welcome picture in his office. He hung it on the living room wall, right above the fireplace, a more honored spot than any expensive artwork he had ever owned. He stood there, stepped back, and admired it. The picture wasn't just a piece of art. It was a mirror. David looked at the picture and then at the man he had been 6 months ago, empty, lonely, and obsessed with numbers. He had gone from a man living for money to a man living for love. He had found the meaning of his life not on the stock exchange floor, but in the laughter of a child. David gently stroked the frame. He smiled a warm, contented smile. In his effort to save a child, he had found salvation for himself. The story closed with the image of David standing there gazing at the picture, knowing that his greatest achievement in life wasn't the numbers, but the happy smile of a daughter and the home they had built together. David and Mary's story is a powerful reminder to all of us. Kindness doesn't come with a price, and happiness can't be measured in money. Just one moment of listening, one small act, and you can become someone's dawn. Take a moment to reflect on your own life and ask yourself what truly makes you happy, and what will you do to spread that joy? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next heartwarming stories.